There is a question that has lingered across Australia for months. A question that carries a quiet ache every time it is asked. How does a 4-year-old boy vanish in broad daylight on a remote homestead, surrounded by people who loved him, and leave behind nothing? No footprints, no clothing, no confirmed sighting, no trace at all. It is a question that unsettles families, frustrates investigators, and stirs something deeper in anyone who has ever driven across the wide, open spaces of the Australian interior. Because if a child can disappear so completely in a place that should have revealed every mark on the ground, then what does that say about the land we thought we understood? The South Australian Outback is not an empty backdrop in this story. It is a presence, vast, silent, unforgiving. By late afternoon, when the heat softens and the light shifts into its muted gold, the land can feel almost still. Yet that stillness hides countless variables. Wind that erases signs within minutes, soil that looks firm but collapses with the slightest weight, vegetation that swallows movement, and horizons that disorient even those who grew up here. It is in this environment that Gus Lamont was last seen, only meters from the homestead where he was staying with his family. And it is in this same environment that one of the most extensive searches in South Australian history unfolded, failing to produce even the smallest clue. This is why the disappearance of Gus has taken hold of the national conversation in a way few cases do. Australia has seen missing child investigations before, some resolved, some still open. Yet there is something different about this one. The lack of evidence is not just unusual, it is disarming. In most searches, even when the outcome is heartbreaking, there is at least a thread, a footprint, an item of clothing, a disruption in the ground, a credible sighting. Here, none of that exists. The search covered multiple kilometers, combed by ground teams, aerial support, drones, thermal imaging, and experienced trackers familiar with outback terrain. And yet, within the first 72 hours, the most critical window in any missing child case, there was nothing to anchor the investigators' efforts. Those first 3 days form the core of what makes this case so perplexing. The timeline is clear in its broad strokes. Gus was seen at around 5 p.m. near a mound of dirt a short distance from the homestead. By 5:30 p.m., when his grandmother called out for him and received no response, the family began searching the immediate area. By 8 p.m., with daylight fading and anxiety rising, the call to SAPOL was made. Overnight, local resources and volunteers searched with torches, vehicles, and whatever equipment they could gather. It was immediate, intensive, and appropriate for the environment. But even with this response, even with the urgency and scale, the land did not give anything back. No signs of distress, no shifted ground, no prints that could be linked to a small child. For many Australians, this absence of evidence has become its own source of unease. It challenges the assumptions people hold about outback searches, assumptions built on logic, experience, and the belief that the land, in its harshness, still leaves clues. This leads to the central question that continues to echo through households, newsrooms, and community forums across the country. If no evidence exists, what exactly happened? It is a question that does not demand blame or speculation, but rather clarity. It reflects the discomfort of not knowing, the tension between what we expect to happen in a missing child case and what unfolded here. In a place where every footstep should leave an impression, why was there none? To explore this question, the purpose of this video is clear: to analyze the facts available, to examine the unique characteristics of the environment, and to understand why an enormous search effort, conducted by trained personnel using recognized methods, still came up empty. This is not a space for sensational theories. It is not an attempt to assign guilt or suggest wrongdoing where none has been confirmed. South Australia Police have been consistent. There is no evidence of foul play. At the same time, they have not closed the door on any possibility. All avenues remain open because the absence of evidence does not lead to a single conclusion. The aim is to build a grounded perspective, one that looks at the known details without exaggeration and without assuming what cannot be proven. It means acknowledging the Outback not just as a location, but as a factor, one capable of complicating even the most organized search. It means examining how quickly conditions can change, how easily small movements go unnoticed, and how a child's behavior in a moment of confusion can diverge sharply from adult logic. Most importantly, it means recognizing the impact this case has had on the Australian public. The disappearance of a child in a rural or remote community strikes a particularly deep chord in this country. Perhaps it is because so many Australians have travelled through long stretches of land where human presence seems fragile. Perhaps it is because the idea of community responsibility, of keeping an eye on each other, is deeply ingrained in rural life. Or perhaps it is because, in a place as open as the Outback, the idea of losing someone without a single trace feels almost impossible. Yet here we are. Months later, the same core questions remain unanswered, and the same mystery hangs over the case. It is not the complexity of the evidence that confounds investigators, but the lack of it. The idea that a small child could move through this environment without leaving something behind challenges both professional experience and public expectation. As we begin this examination, the intention is not to reach a definitive answer. Instead, it is to understand why the answers are still out of reach. To focus on what is known, what is not known, and what may have contributed to the silence in the evidence, whether environmental, behavioral, or procedural. It is an attempt to bring clarity to a case defined by uncertainty. Because until the truth is found, these questions will continue to be asked, not out of suspicion or judgment, but out of a collective need for understanding. To understand how investigators approached this case, it is essential to look at the environment in which Gus was living and the family structure that shaped his daily routines. The Lamont family were staying at Oak Park Station, a remote pastoral property typical of South Australia's outback regions. Life here follows a rhythm that differs from suburban or city settings. Distances are broader. Routines are shaped by livestock work and daylight, and children often spend more time outdoors than those in more populated areas. It is a lifestyle built around familiarity with the land, but also one that carries its own risks when visibility, sound, and movement behave differently across open country. For a child like Gus, this environment was both a home and a playground. Families living on or visiting properties such as Oak Park Station usually develop a routine that balances independence with supervision. Children are often comfortable exploring short distances from the homestead, especially in the late afternoon when temperatures dip and shadows lengthen. What may appear to outsiders as a vast, exposed landscape can feel, to those living there, like an extended backyard. This sense of familiarity influences how young children move, how far they believe they can wander, and how quickly they may stray without realizing it. Understanding these everyday behaviors helps explain why the initial focus of the search remained close to the homestead. Gus's daily habits form an important part of this picture. As a 4-year-old, he was at an age where curiosity often outweighs caution. Children in this developmental stage commonly shift attention quickly, follow small distractions, and move without predictable patterns. In rural and remote environments, that tendency can become magnified. A mound of dirt, a water trough, a cluster of rocks, or even an insect can draw a child's interest, leading them a few meters further from where adults last saw them. Small decisions, made without awareness of distance or direction, can accumulate into unexpected movement across terrain that seems straightforward at first glance. Within the Lamont family, each member played a specific role that helped investigators model likely behaviors and movement patterns. Gus's mother and grandmother were central figures in his daily routine. They understood his habits, his preferences, and the ways he typically responded to the environment around him. Their accounts gave Task Force Horizon essential details: how comfortable he was outdoors, whether he tended to avoid certain noises, and how he reacted when he felt unsure or overwhelmed. These small behavioral cues assist in building a realistic model of where a child might wander when left unsupervised for only a short period. At the time of the disappearance, Gus was under the care of his grandmother. This is not unusual in regional families, where extended relatives often support childcare while adults are working on the property. Her familiarity with the station and with Gus's temperament provided investigators with critical insight into how long he might have remained in one area before moving on, and whether he was likely to seek shelter or simply continue walking. In many outback environments, even a minor delay in recognizing a child has moved out of sight can create significant challenges for search teams later on. The role of Gus's father, though different, was also important to the overall understanding of the household. Investigators interviewed him, as they do with all family members in missing child cases, to gather contextual information about Gus's broader behavior and emotional world. Understanding how the family interacted, who typically supervised outdoor play, what boundaries were set for Gus, and whether he had shown any recent changes in behavior, helped refine the working models of the search. None of this information is used to assign suspicion. Instead, it supports the development of accurate timelines and movement projections. Living in the outback shapes family routines in ways that are often invisible to those unfamiliar with remote life. Oak Park Station, like many large pastoral properties, is surrounded by open stretches of land broken by patches of vegetation, dry creek beds, and dirt tracks. Sound carries differently here, and visual markers can blend into the landscape. These factors influence how quickly an adult may realize a child has moved beyond the immediate area. They also affect how investigators evaluate the family's timeline. The absence of noise, the uniformity of the ground, and the presence of natural barriers can create small pockets where a child might move without being noticed. Task Force Horizon relied heavily on information from the Lamont family to reconstruct the timeline of the afternoon. Family interviews helped establish the last confirmed sighting of Gus, the tasks being carried out around that time, and the distances typically considered safe for him to explore. These details gave investigators a starting point for their search grids and modeling. Without this baseline, the search area would have been significantly broader and more difficult to prioritize. The family's knowledge of the station, the terrain, and Gus's patterns of movement became essential elements in shaping the early stages of the investigation. Behavioral specialists working with missing child cases often emphasize the importance of the family perspective. Only those closest to the child can describe their fears, preferences, and natural responses. For example, some children run toward sound, others move away from it. Some seek shelter, others remain in open space. These traits influence how far a child may travel in a short window and whether they might enter thick vegetation, climb onto elevated surfaces, or follow an animal track. In Gus's case, his mother and grandmother's accounts were especially valuable in helping search teams identify areas where he was more or less likely to go. While the broader public may see the Lamont family through media reports, investigators engage with them through a different lens, one focused on gathering accurate, functional information. This difference matters. Media narratives often highlight emotion, absence, or perceived inconsistency. But for investigators, the family's role is practical and essential. Their input helps refine search zones, adjust search strategies, and understand the child's baseline behavior. Even small pieces of information, such as Gus's tendency to follow certain animals or avoid particular textures underfoot, can shift the direction of a search. Ultimately, what we know about the Lamont household is defined not by speculation, but by the information that has been confirmed. A family living in a remote environment, following routines shaped by outback life, caring for a child who was familiar with the land but too young to recognize its dangers. Their insight formed the initial foundation of the investigation and continues to guide how Task Force Horizon assesses new information. In cases like this, the family remains the anchor point from which every model begins and against which every possibility is measured. Reconstructing the first 72 hours of any missing child case is critical. But in an outback environment, the timeline becomes even more significant. Distances expand quickly, visibility changes within minutes, and the landscape can reshape what witnesses remember. For investigators working on the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, the timeline built from the family's accounts formed the framework for every search decision made in the early hours. What follows is a factual reconstruction based on the information publicly released, reflecting how search teams and analysts approached those first crucial days. The last confirmed sighting of Gus was around 5 p.m., when he was near the homestead area of Oak Park Station. It was a typical late afternoon moment, light beginning to soften, temperature dropping into a more comfortable range, and the environment entering that transitional stage where shadows stretch and small changes in visibility occur. At this time of day, sounds carry unevenly, and the contrast between bright areas and shade becomes sharper, making it easier for a child to slip out of view without immediate notice. According to the family's statements, Gus was within the usual safe perimeter where he often played, and there was no indication he intended to wander far. By approximately 5:30 p.m., the family had begun their own search within a radius of roughly 200 to 300 meters around the homestead. This distance is consistent with what investigators typically observe in disappearances involving young children. At age 4, a child can move faster than adults often assume, especially when terrain is mostly flat and unobstructed. A 30-minute window can be enough for a child to cover several hundred meters, particularly if they are curious, distracted, or following something that captures their attention. However, terrain around Oak Park Station includes subtle depressions, scattered vegetation, and uneven ground, features that can obscure a small figure within seconds. The family's initial search focused on the immediate surroundings: sheds, tracks near the homestead, nearby scrub, and open patches of land. These areas are generally the first to be checked because they are both accessible and likely places where a child may pause, hide, or become disoriented. When no immediate signs of Gus were found, concern escalated. Families in remote communities are often familiar with how quickly daylight fades and how drastically the environment alters after sunset. By the time the family realized Gus had moved beyond the expected area, the window of optimal visibility was already closing. At around 8 p.m., the family contacted the South Australia Police, SAPOL. This timing has been the subject of discussion among the public, but investigators commonly observe similar delays in remote settings. Families often devote significant time to searching before calling authorities, hoping the child is still close and will respond to voice calls or return to a familiar point. Outback families also understand the isolation of their environment and may initially believe their own knowledge of the land will be more helpful in the early stages. It is only when those methods fail that the seriousness of the situation becomes fully apparent. Once SAPOL was notified, officers initiated the formal search response. Nightfall had already set in, which introduced immediate limitations. Night searches in outback conditions are challenging due to low visibility, variable ground temperatures, and unpredictable wind patterns. Thermal imaging becomes harder when the ground remains hot from the day's heat, and noise can travel in ways that make locating a child more complex. Despite these barriers, search teams commenced their work, focusing first on high-risk zones close to the homestead. The first night produced no confirmed traces of Gus. This outcome, though difficult for the family and confronting to the public, is not unusual in remote missing child cases. Outback terrain can hide footprints within minutes if wind is active. Soft ground, loose dirt, and patches of spinifex can hold impressions poorly, especially those made by a child's light weight. Additionally, a 4-year-old's movement patterns are typically inconsistent. They may walk in short bursts, pause frequently, or turn abruptly in response to noise, light, or environmental features. These behaviors make it difficult to predict direction without physical evidence. As dawn broke on the second day, SAPOL expanded the search radius. Volunteers, State Emergency Service, SES, personnel, and trained trackers were deployed to cover a larger grid. The modeling for this expansion was based on the family-provided timeline, with analysts estimating how far a 4-year-old might travel in the hours between 5 p.m. and nightfall. Children at this age often wander without a sense of distance, sometimes walking until they encounter a barrier, shade, or a point of interest. The absence of these predictable markers in the outback environment increases the likelihood of a child traveling in an irregular, non-linear path. The heat of the second day also played a role. Rising temperatures change the texture of the ground, affect visibility for airborne searches, and reduce the reliability of scent trails for search dogs. Tracks made the previous evening may have evaporated or been distorted. Search teams worked methodically, but the terrain provided few clues. At this stage, the timeline's accuracy remained crucial. Any uncertainty about the exact minutes in which Gus may have moved created a wider potential zone for searchers. By the end of the second day, there was still no sign of clothing, footprints, or physical objects associated with Gus. Although this surprised some members of the public, investigators recognize that the outback can erase evidence far more quickly than urban environments. Wind patterns, ground heat, and even light rain can eliminate subtle indications of movement. Search teams reported that conditions in the area were consistent with rapid surface changes, making it difficult to detect small disturbances left by a child. The third day marked a shift in strategy. With expanding search grids and no confirmed sightings, Task Force Horizon adjusted their modeling to include more complex child behavior scenarios. Erratic wandering patterns, potential hiding responses, or short-term sheltering behind natural features. Children may conceal themselves when overwhelmed, which can make them harder to locate even when search teams are close. The absence of audible responses from Gus did not necessarily indicate distress. Some children simply do not call out when lost, either due to fear or confusion. Throughout these 3 days, a key challenge remained: the inherent variability in the family's timeline. This is not unusual. In high-stress situations, adults often misjudge small increments of time. A perceived 5 minutes can become 10. A brief period of distraction might be remembered differently once panic sets in. For investigators, even a discrepancy of 5 minutes can significantly alter search calculations. In outback terrain, such a variance could represent hundreds of meters of additional search space, enough to shift the search grid entirely. SAPL accounted for these uncertainties by constantly revising their working models. As more information from the family became available, clarifications about tasks performed that afternoon, recollections about what Gus was wearing, or small behavioral details, the timeline was adjusted. This iterative approach is standard practice, especially when the environment is as unforgiving as remote South Australia. The 72-hour period concluded without a clear lead, but this does not diminish the importance of the timeline. It remains the anchor for all subsequent analysis, guiding every expansion of the search, every recalculation of distance, and every reassessment of likely movement patterns. In an environment where evidence is scarce and conditions change quickly, the timeline remains the most reliable component of the investigation, an evolving, carefully scrutinized document that shapes every decision moving forward. The scale of the search mounted for 4-year-old Gus Lamont was unprecedented for South Australia in 2025. Although large operations have been conducted across the state in the past, few have matched the rapid mobilisation and broad coordination seen at Oak Park Station. The case drew together police, specialised search personnel, aviation units, and volunteers across multiple regions. Yet, despite everything carried out according to established procedure, the effort yielded no definitive trace of Gus. The outcome has raised difficult questions about how even the most structured, highly resourced search can struggle in remote terrain. From the moment SAPOL activated the official response on the night Gus was reported missing, multiple units were deployed. Ground teams were the first to arrive, followed by SES volunteers trained in rural search techniques. Their role in the early hours was focused on checking high likelihood zones around the homestead: sheds, vehicles, water sources, windmills, stockyards, and clusters of vegetation. These areas are typically prioritized because children are known to pause or shelter in places that offer shade, protection, or distraction. Despite thorough sweeps, no indicators were found. As daylight returned on the second day, SAPOL expanded the operation. Fixed-wing aircraft, helicopters, and drones equipped with thermal imaging were introduced. The Australian Defence Force was requested for logistical support, providing additional personnel and equipment to extend the reach of the search. The presence of multiple agencies was not unusual. In large-scale rural disappearances, such cooperation is essential. Each unit brings a different capability. The SES contributes ground coverage, SAPOL provides investigative structure, and ADF members enhance endurance and reach in difficult terrain. Helicopters played a significant role in the early phase. Crews flew low-altitude runs over open plains, creek lines, and ridge lines where a child might have traveled or taken cover. However, outback conditions imposed limitations almost immediately. Heat radiating from the ground distorted visual clarity, especially during midday hours. Shadows cast by trees and mulga scrub created inconsistent contrast, hindering aerial spotters who rely on uniform lighting to identify anomalies below. In many cases, terrain features, rocks, fallen branches, spinifex clusters, can resemble clothing or movement from a distance, making verification slow. Fixed-wing aircraft, meanwhile, covered larger sections of land. These planes are efficient for mapping broad zones, but cannot provide the same level of detail as helicopters. They are used primarily to rule out major sections of the landscape and to guide ground teams towards areas that demand closer inspection. In the Lamont search, fixed-wing flights were conducted repeatedly, creating a detailed grid for analysts to review. Yet again, no confirmed signs emerged. Thermal drones were expected to be a game-changer, given their ability to detect heat signatures obscured to the human eye. But outback thermal conditions are counterintuitive. The ground retains heat from the day and releases it slowly through the evening, creating false positives and saturating the thermal image with background radiation. Small bodies, especially those of young children, can blend into the thermal environment, making it extremely difficult to differentiate a genuine signature from residual heat. Operators reported variable readings, none of which could be confirmed as belonging to Gus. On the ground, SES and SAPOL teams conducted line searches, foot patrols, and targeted sweeps. These were coordinated according to a standard search grid, a well-established model used across Australia that divides land into manageable squares. Each team was assigned to a grid and proceeded gradually, ensuring no section was overlooked. However, even the most disciplined grid search can miss small deviations in terrain, particularly in areas characterized by thick undergrowth, undulating ground, or loose soil. In the Lamont case, the ground texture and vegetation density were inconsistent, increasing the risk of minor traces being obscured. Road-based searches complemented the ground effort. Tracks leading in and out of Oak Park Station were monitored for tire impressions, disturbances on the verge, and any physical object that might have fallen from a passing vehicle. These checks were repeated on subsequent days to ensure no detail was missed in earlier assessments. Police also questioned nearby property owners and motorists who could have been in the region at the time. However, as in many remote disappearances, traffic in the area was minimal, and no eyewitness reports were recorded. One of the core difficulties was that the search followed established procedure, yet the environment behaved outside predictable patterns. Outback terrain can alter within hours. Wind can erase footprints, sediment can shift over tracks, and light can distort surface detail. Even well-trained trackers can only work with what remains visible, and in this case, there was almost nothing to work with. Detecting a child's footprint in loose earth is already difficult. Detecting it after wind exposure is near impossible. Early in the search, investigators examined several points of interest that appeared promising. A disturbed patch of ground, a cluster of broken twigs, and partial impressions near a fence line. Each was assessed, logged, and cross-checked, but none provided confirmed links to Gus. These initial leads generated public discussion, but in professional search operations, many seemingly significant findings are later ruled out. Natural animal activity, environmental shifts, or unrelated human movement can all produce misleading signs. In an area as expansive as Oak Park Station, these false indicators are common. As the operation progressed, SAPOL analysts compared their findings with patterns seen in other search failures across Northern Territory and Western Australia. In several cases, despite substantial resources, missing individuals remained undetected for extended periods or were later found outside the original modelling zones. These comparisons revealed consistent themes: underestimation of a child's mobility, misjudged starting points, environmental interference, and gaps in early eyewitness recollection. None of these factors involves negligence. Instead, they reflect the inherent limitations of search methodology when positioned against vast, unforgiving landscapes. In the Lamont case, search crews covered distances far exceeding the typical radius for a missing 4-year-old. Despite extending the grid, incorporating aerial assets, and applying thermal technology, the system encountered the same environmental constraints documented in previous Outback operations. Terrain complexity does not always reveal itself immediately, and by the time search teams reach an area, subtle clues may have already disappeared. The investigative team's challenge lay not in the effort itself, but in the environment's ability to absorb and erase evidence faster than it could be located. By the conclusion of the formal, large-scale search window, SAPOL acknowledged that all standard procedures had been followed. Ground, air, and drone teams had covered thousands of hectares. Analysts had reviewed thermal footage, aerial maps, and grid reports. Volunteers and professionals alike had contributed extensive hours. Yet the central question persisted: how could such a large, coordinated effort produce no trace? For investigators, the answer was not one of failure, but of environmental dominance. The Outback, in its vastness, unpredictability, and natural force, can nullify even the most comprehensive search systems. While the operation transitioned into a scaled-down investigative phase, the lessons remained clear. Large-scale searches, even when executed flawlessly, confront limitations that cannot be fully overcome. The Lamont search demonstrated that South Australia's most robust resources can still meet boundaries imposed by terrain, climate, and time. The absence of evidence does not equate to a lack of action. Instead, it underscores the harsh reality of remote landscapes where visibility, traces, and movement can vanish within minutes. The search stands as one of the most extensive operations of 2025, marked by professional coordination and significant resource deployment. Its outcome, however, echoes similar challenges seen across other states. The environment, not the effort, dictates the result. For the Lamont case, this reality continues to shape the investigation moving forward, reminding the public and authorities alike that even the strongest systems are not immune to the vastness of the Outback. The Outback surrounding Oak Park Station is one of the most challenging environments in Australia when it comes to preserving any form of physical trace. To understand why the extensive search for 4-year-old Gus Lamont yielded no confirmed evidence, it is necessary to examine the terrain itself, its texture, its climate, and the natural forces that shape it. These conditions, while familiar to those who live in remote South Australia, often come as a surprise to the broader public, particularly when the absence of footprints or objects seems to defy expectation. In reality, the landscape is neither mysterious nor unusual. It simply operates under principles that make the detection of small, fragile clues extremely difficult. The ground at Oak Park consists of a mix of sandy soil, compacted dirt, and fine gravel. This combination is common throughout the region and is known for its instability when exposed to wind. During much of the year, winds between 25 and 40 kilometers per hour move across open plains. These winds are strong enough to erase shallow imprints rapidly. Footprints left by a young child, weighing significantly less than an adult, are particularly vulnerable. In such conditions, a footprint may remain visible for only 15 to 60 minutes before being altered beyond recognition. This window can close even faster during periods of higher wind or when loose topsoil has been disturbed by livestock. The terrain's tendency to shift creates a surface that is constantly resetting itself. Even when teams arrive at a location only 1 or 2 hours after an event, there may be little left for them to observe. Search crews trained in reading ground disturbances often describe Outback soil as active, not in a geological sense, but in the way it responds immediately to environmental pressure. A faint trail, a scuff mark, or the imprint from a small shoe may look stable in the moment, yet disappear entirely once the wind rises or the sun begins to harden the surface. Twilight hours further complicate the ability to analyze the ground. Between late afternoon and early evening, the angle of light produces long shadows and irregular contrast. This optical effect makes it difficult to differentiate indentations from natural texture. Searchers explain that footprints, when shallow, do not cast the kind of shadow needed for identification unless the sun strikes them at the right angle. In many cases, what appears to be an impression may simply be a shift in dirt caused by wind, while actual footprints disappear into the surrounding patterns of gravel and sand. As night falls, the situation becomes even more complex. Artificial lighting, torches, vehicle lights, helicopter spotlights, creates reflection on loose sediment, which masks small variations in the ground. When searching at night, teams tend to rely more on structured movement and coverage rather than visual detection of prints. Any footprint left before darkness is easily lost unless protected from the wind, which is rarely the case in open terrain. Vegetation also plays a role in obscuring evidence. The region around Oak Park is characterized by mulga scrub, spinifex clusters, and low-lying bushes. These plants form natural barriers that break visual lines and conceal small objects. Spinifex, in particular, grows in tightly packed mounds that can hide footprints or items within its outer layer of spikes. Even a lightweight object, if blown or dropped into a patch of spinifex, can become lodged deep enough to avoid immediate visibility. Mulga branches, meanwhile, shed bark and twigs that scatter across the ground, producing disturbances that mimic or cover genuine marks. In practical terms, this vegetation acts as a filter. It catches and retains debris, reducing the likelihood that a footprint, piece of clothing, or other physical indicator will remain uncovered. During searches, crews often describe mulga scrub as a visual clutter zone, a place where every square meter contains overlapping patterns that confuse the eye. Identifying a subtle ground depression in these areas requires both time and perfect lighting, neither of which can be guaranteed during an urgent search. Another factor is the natural behavior of the soil in relation to temperature. Throughout the day, the ground heats up significantly under direct sunlight. As temperatures cool at dusk, the top layer expands and contracts, smoothing microfeatures on the surface. This daily cycle can distort or fade prints within hours. The effect is more pronounced after warm afternoons, when the surface becomes more malleable. By the time search teams arrive, sometimes even within the first evening, the environment may have already neutralized the footprint's definition. It is important to consider the scale of the area as well. Oak Park Station covers thousands of hectares, with terrain that shifts from open plains to shallow creek beds. Creek lines often collect sediment that moves easily when stepped on, but then dries with a smooth crust that shows little evidence of previous disturbance. If a child walks through a creek line shortly before the surface begins to dry again, the footprint may flatten out and appear to merge with the natural texture. The presence of livestock introduces additional challenges. Cattle often traverse the same spaces that searchers examine. Their movement churns the ground, overlays footprints, and creates new indentations that complicate interpretation. A single cow walking across a faint set of prints can erase them entirely. Because animals move unpredictably across station properties, their paths can intersect with search areas in ways that impact what is left to observe. Some members of the public question how a large search, equipped with modern technology, could fail to locate even one clear trace. To understand this, it is necessary to recognize that ground evidence relies on two factors: the existence of a trace and the ability to detect it. The Outback undermines both. A trace may never form properly if the surface is too hard or too soft. Likewise, if it does form, it may not persist long enough for teams to reach it. The environment effectively compresses the time frame during which evidence can be found, reducing opportunity to almost zero in certain conditions. This context explains why the absence of footprints does not necessarily indicate that Gus did not pass through a particular area. Rather, it reflects the natural behavior of the land. In many previous cases across South Australia, Northern Territory, and Western Australia, children and adults were later found in locations that originally showed no visible prints. These cases demonstrate that the Outback can retain its appearance even after multiple people have walked through it. Wind plays the most aggressive role in this erasure. When gusts rise above 30 kilometers per hour, fine sand begins to drift across the surface, filling indentations with new material. Within minutes, the shape of a footprint can be lost. When winds remain consistent for several hours, as they often do in this region, the entire surface may reset. To an untrained observer, the terrain may appear untouched, even though movement occurred recently. In areas with mixed vegetation, footprints often form only partially, leaving broken impressions that search teams cannot confirm as belonging to a child. Because identification requires a distinct pattern, heel, toe, or stride, these partial markings are not considered reliable evidence. In the Lamont operation, several possible impressions were documented but ultimately ruled inconclusive. Understanding these environmental realities also clarifies why aerial and drone searches were unable to identify ground disturbances. Even from low altitudes, changes in soil color or texture are too subtle to detect if the surface has been flattened by wind. Spinifex patches obscure details, while mulga shadows mimic irregularities. Thermal imaging is designed to locate heat sources, not ground markings. Therefore, it cannot identify footprints at all. Taken together, these elements form a landscape that actively resists investigation. It is not that the Outback conceals evidence in a deliberate sense. Rather, it neutralizes evidence by sheer force of nature. The environment is constantly in motion, constantly reshaping itself, and constantly rebalancing the surface. For investigators, this means that the absence of evidence is not unexpected. In fact, it is a known characteristic of searching in remote Australia. Experienced search teams understand that footprints disappear quickly. Objects shift under wind pressure, and vegetation masks the ground. As a result, the failure to locate clear traces does not provide any insight into what did or did not happen to Gus. Instead, it highlights the limitations of even the most thorough search when placed against the vastness and volatility of the Outback. The region around Oak Park Station exemplifies a harsh but natural truth. The land does not preserve small details. It erases them. It absorbs them. And it does so with speed and consistency. This reality underpins the understanding that the lack of visible evidence says more about the landscape than about any individual's actions or the nature of the disappearance. In the continuing investigation into the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont, South Australia Police have maintained a consistent position. There is still no definitive evidence pointing to any single explanation. Because of that, the case remains open to several major possibilities, each grounded in documented patterns from previous Outback searches and established investigative practice across Australia. When the landscape offers no clear signs, and when the timeline of a young child contains natural uncertainties, investigators are required to keep multiple scenarios active, rather than narrowing prematurely. What follows is a consolidated, continuous assessment of the 4 primary hypotheses that remain relevant, written with the same caution and factual restraint shown in official communication. One possibility is that Gus walked away from the homestead independently, following a pattern that search experts have seen repeatedly in young children throughout remote Australia. Children of this age rarely travel in straight lines. Their movement tends to reflect whatever captures their attention in the moment. A sound carried on the wind, a distant object, a patch of scrub, or a change in the ground's color can cause them to change direction abruptly. Case studies from the Northern Territory, Queensland, and Western Australia all show similar patterns. Rather than moving purposefully toward a destination, children wander in irregular arcs, loops, or zigzags. This creates a situation where their total distance traveled may be far greater than the radius predicted by search modeling.
This wandering behavior is also shaped by the environment. In open country, such as Outback Station, small rises, shallow creek beds, and scattered mulga patches serve as visual cues, each capable of redirecting movement without the child recognizing the change. With no footprints to indicate where Gus may have stepped, investigators have no ability to confirm whether he followed a consistent heading or shifted directions repeatedly. The lack of evidence is not unusual. The soil composition in that part of South Australia creates shallow impressions that dissipate quickly. Under winds of 25 to 40 kilometers per hour, a clear footprint can lose definition within minutes. Search teams operating on foot and by air rely heavily on footprints to define direction. Without them, modeling becomes less reliable. Independent wandering also accounts for the possibility that Gus covered more distance than expected before stopping. Children under stress may not call out for help, especially when outdoors in an unfamiliar setting. They may continue walking until fatigued. This behavior has been documented in multiple rural cases. For that reason, the absence of signs near the homestead does not contradict the possibility that he simply walked beyond the earliest grid lines. Another hypothesis focuses on concealment within the landscape, rather than movement away from it. The outback contains numerous microenvironments, small spaces that can fully hide a child from view even when searchers pass close by. Shallow erosion channels, compact gullies, clusters of mulga, and dense spinifex all create strong visual barriers. A child seeking shade or a place to rest may move naturally into one of these features. Once inside, visibility becomes extremely limited. The shadows created by late afternoon light can cause these features to blend into the surrounding terrain, a phenomenon that has been noted in past search reports from SA and NT. Examples from previous cases demonstrate how easily a small child can become obscured. In one WA incident, a toddler was found inside a shallow trench less than 100 meters from a track, missed multiple times by foot teams and helicopters. The child's clothing blended with the soil tones, and the trench's angle shielded him from aerial imaging. Similar blind spots exist around Outback Station, where mulga stands overlap in irregular patterns and creek lines create narrow depressions. If Gus moved into one of these areas, his visibility would have depended on the angle of approach, the height of the sun, and the presence of shifting shadows. Even thermal imaging struggles in such environments because ground heat can overwhelm or distort readings. The environment's influence forms a third hypothesis, that natural forces affected Gus's movement, visibility, or ability to respond. This does not imply any specific outcome. It simply acknowledges that the outback imposes conditions that can change rapidly and unpredictably. Wind can disorient a child, causing them to turn away from the homestead or alter direction without realizing. Uneven ground can lead to slips or minor falls, slowing progress or pushing a child into an unexpected area. The transition from late afternoon warmth to evening cool can also affect behavior, reducing energy levels and prompting a child to stop, sit, or seek shade earlier than expected. Environmental impact covers a wide range of natural interactions. It recognizes that exposure, disorientation, and fatigue may influence the distance traveled and the final position where a child rests. Even without injury, reduced visibility caused by fading light can lead a child to move toward darker terrain that feels sheltered, making detection harder for search teams arriving after sunset.
The first night remains one of the most difficult periods in any Outback search, as thermal limitations, low light, and shifting winds combine to reduce the effectiveness of aerial and ground resources. The fourth hypothesis considers the possibility that another party was involved, though it is treated with extreme caution due to lack of supporting evidence. SAPOL has stated repeatedly that there is no indication of foul play. No suspicious vehicles have been confirmed, no signs of forced contact exist, and no physical evidence points toward human involvement. However, contemporary missing child protocols require investigators to keep this scenario open until evidence definitively excludes it.
This is not an implication of wrongdoing by anyone known to the family or anyone in the area. It is a procedural safeguard. Remote properties do receive occasional visitors, contractors, service vehicles, neighboring station workers, or travelers passing through. In prior SA and NT cases, children unintentionally approached or followed vehicles without the driver noticing, creating circumstances where the child was moved from the area without malicious intent. While there is no evidence that such a situation occurred at Oak Park, investigators cannot rule it out solely based on the absence of sightings. The vast distances and low traffic volumes make verification difficult. Another remote but documented behavior involves children climbing into or onto vehicles due to curiosity. Though uncommon, the possibility cannot be dismissed outright unless evidence contradicts it. For these reasons, even without indicators, SAPOL continues to maintain the procedural stance that removal by another party remains a theoretical possibility. They do not expand publicly on this scenario because doing so without evidence risks creating unnecessary speculation. When viewed as a whole, these four hypotheses reflect the balance investigators must maintain in a case defined more by what is not known than by what is. None can be confirmed. None can be dismissed. Each sits within the investigative framework because the environment, the timeline, uncertainties, and the lack of physical evidence make it impossible to prioritize one explanation over another. This approach is consistent with national standards for missing person investigations in complex terrains. It keeps the inquiry open, measured, and focused on evidence rather than assumption, allowing Task Force Horizon to continue working toward clarity in a landscape that provides very little to work with. Across Australia, the disappearance of 4-year-old Gus Lamont has created a level of public uncertainty that goes well beyond the typical response to a missing child case. It is not due to sensational detail or confirmed evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, it stems from a kind of national discomfort born from gaps that no one has been able to close. When a case produces little physical evidence, few confirmed sightings, and no clear narrative, the community naturally begins to fill those empty spaces with questions, possibilities, and, at times, speculation. This is not unique to this case, but the scale of silence surrounding the early hours has amplified the reaction across the country. One of the main forces driving national doubt is what investigators often call the absence paradox. The more a case lacks evidence, the more the public senses that something is missing in a deeper sense.
When nothing concrete is found, many Australians instinctively assume that the official version does not account for the full picture. In reality, the absence of evidence is common in remote area searches, especially in outback terrain that erases tracks within minutes and scatters scent rapidly. But because the public does not experience these conditions day to day, the lack of physical signs feels unnatural, even suspicious. This mismatch between lived experience and outback reality has significantly shaped public perception. As the days passed without answers, social media became a space where confusion spread quickly. Comments, theories, and suggestions circulated with a speed that outpaced the slow, methodical pace of a rural investigation. For many Australians watching from cities or coastal towns, the outback remained something distant and unfamiliar. Its sheer size and silence create an impression of both isolation and possibility.
Without a map of the area,
or an understanding of how easily a child's movement can disappear into shallow gullies, mulga stands, or low scrub, people online interpret the lack of evidence not as a natural outcome of the environment, but as a sign that something is wrong with the narrative. This tension has produced a set of recurring public questions, repeated across forums, comment sections, and community discussions. The first is simple but emotionally loaded. If Gus wandered off alone, where is the evidence of that movement? Many imagine clear footprints, visible paths, or clothing fibers, signs that would remain long enough to be found. But Outback soil combined with 25 to 40-kilometer winds erases footprints within a quarter of an hour. Shadows during late afternoon distort impressions. Loose sand lifts easily, and animals can disturb surface markings without leaving identifiable signs.
These environmental realities, while obvious to local station workers and search teams, feel counterintuitive to those living elsewhere. Another common question centers on the possibility of third-party involvement. If someone removed the boy, how is it possible that no vehicle was seen, no camera captured movement, and no unusual activity was reported? To the general public, the absence of surveillance footage or clear sightings tends to indicate improbability. But the Outback is not suburban Australia. Much of remote SA, NT, and WA operates without CCTV, without consistent vehicle traffic, and without neighbours close enough to notice irregular movement. A single vehicle travelling on a long station track at the right time of day could easily pass without being seen by anyone. This reality does not suggest that removal is likely. It simply explains why the absence of footage cannot by itself resolve the question. A third question arises from the environment itself. If Gus fell, became trapped, or sought shelter somewhere, why has no physical trace been detected? Australians following the case often underestimate how effectively the Outback conceals. Spinifex grows in thick clumps large enough to mask a small child, and its color blends with clothing tones in certain lighting. Mulga scrub creates dense shadows that aerial imaging struggles to penetrate, especially during the transition between late afternoon and early evening. Small erosion channels form pockets deep enough to hide someone from ground-level view. Without direct evidence, many assume that these possibilities should produce at least one discoverable sign. But past cases show that environmental concealment can persist for extended periods, sometimes until weather shifts or accidental discovery occurs. Underlying all these questions is a broader cultural tendency in Australia: the need for closure. When a mystery remains unresolved, particularly one involving a child, the national response is shaped by an instinctive desire to bring order to uncertainty. Australians often expect clear timelines, confirmed evidence, and identifiable causes. In rural and remote investigations, such clarity is rare, and the resulting gap creates discomfort. This unease often leads to passive suspicion, not targeted at any individual, but directed at the situation itself. People want to believe that missing information means something has been overlooked, rather than accepting that the environment can erase nearly all traces. This psychological pattern becomes more pronounced when official updates remain limited. SAPOL's commitment to factual, non-speculative communication is standard practice, but for many watching the case, the restrained tone feels too measured. Some interpret the absence of detail as withholding information, even when the reality is far less dramatic. There is simply nothing new to share publicly. Investigations in remote environments require constant verification and re-evaluation of small fragments, leaving long periods where police have no confirmed material suitable for release. Those pauses create space for public imagination, which fills the silence with what the investigation cannot provide. Another layer of national doubt comes from previous high-profile Australian cases where early assumptions proved incorrect. In several New South Wales and Queensland incidents, families were questioned publicly before evidence later showed that environmental factors were responsible. These past misunderstandings have shaped public expectations, producing a mix of caution and skepticism. Some Australians fear that absence of evidence means an error has occurred.
Others believe it confirms that something more complex is unfolding. Neither perspective aligns neatly with investigative realities, but both influence the wider public mood. It is important to recognize that most of this uncertainty reflects emotional responses rather than factual interpretation. Australians relate strongly to stories of isolation, resilience, and the harshness of remote landscapes. When a child disappears in such a setting, the story resonates deeply with the national identity, one shaped by vast distances and an environment that demands respect. The idea that a child could vanish without leaving a trace clashes with the everyday expectation of order and reason. This tension between cultural imagination and physical reality is one of the main reasons the case remains so present in the national conversation. At its core, the ongoing uncertainty reflects a country searching for answers that the landscape has not provided. The public's questions are not unreasonable. They mirror the same uncertainties held by investigators, families, and communities involved. But while the community seeks conclusive narratives, the investigation must remain grounded in what is known, not what is imagined. The Outback does not behave according to the expectations of suburban logic. It erases quickly, conceals deeply, and reveals reluctantly. Until evidence emerges, the questions circulating across Australia will remain open, not because something has been hidden, but because the environment has not yet given anything up. For many Australians following the disappearance of Gus Lamont, one question continues to surface. With all the modern technology available, drones, thermal imaging, fixed-wing aircraft, and advanced modelling, how is it possible that nothing definitive has been found? The assumption that technology should provide near-perfect answers is understandable. In everyday life, devices feel reliable, predictable, and increasingly sophisticated. But the expectations placed on these tools often exceed what they can realistically deliver in the harsh conditions of the Outback. When the public imagines a large-scale search, they picture crystal-clear imagery, precise tracking, and equipment capable of detecting even the smallest trace. The reality is far more restrained, shaped by physics, weather, and topography that no machine can fully overcome. Drone operations were widely used during the early search efforts. However, one of the least understood limitations is the influence of ground heat. In the late afternoon and early evening, the critical period when search teams began their operation, the soil temperature across remote South Australia can retain heat well above ambient air levels. Thermal imaging relies on detecting differences in temperature, but when the Earth radiates strongly, these contrasts flatten significantly. A drone camera that might easily pick up a heat signature in cooler terrain can lose effectiveness when the entire landscape emits heat almost uniformly. For a small child whose body mass produces a limited thermal footprint, the chance of blending into a hot background becomes even higher. The public often assumes that thermal imaging allows teams to see through terrain in a near superhuman way. In truth, thermal cameras cannot penetrate vegetation, rock, scrub, or even moderate layers of dust. Spinifex clumps, mulga branches, and shallow depressions create thermal shadows, areas where heat signatures are masked by insulating material. A child lying beneath a spinifex tuft, or even partially shielded by a rock formation, may simply not appear on the live feed. The idea that thermal imaging is a perfect detection tool often comes from television and commercial demonstrations set in controlled environments. Once placed into the unpredictable structures of the Outback, those assumptions fall away quickly. Helicopters are another area where public perception diverges from operational reality. Many Australians imagine a helicopter hovering just meters above the ground, scanning for movement with ease. But downdraft, turbulence, and rising heat currents prevent aircraft from operating safely at low altitudes over remote terrain. Pilots must maintain a buffer to avoid dust swirls, mechanical stress, and sudden wind shifts. The higher a helicopter flies, the wider its field of view, but the lower its capacity to detect fine detail. Shadows, color blending, and natural camouflage further complicate visibility. Even in ideal conditions,
heli-based searches cannot identify every footprint, fabric fiber, or small figure tucked between scrub lines. Fixed-wing aircraft, with greater range, contributed to wide-area sweeps. Yet, these flights prioritize coverage over detail. They help confirm that no significant movement, such as a vehicle or large object, occurred across long distances. But they cannot map subtle ground disturbances. Many members of the public assume that satellite-style clarity is possible from these flights. In reality, the resolution is affected by altitude, speed, and the shifting contrast between shaded and sunlit surfaces. Outback topography is full of visual noise: rocks, burnt patches, animal tracks, plant clusters, and erosion channels that make pattern detection extremely difficult. Without a clear anomaly, aircraft crews often have nothing reliable to interpret. AI-based modeling has also been discussed widely, with some believing it should predict the exact path a 4-year-old might have taken. While modeling tools assist search teams by suggesting likely movement zones, they are not designed to produce precise outcomes. These systems rely heavily on average behavior patterns, distance per hour estimates, and terrain ratings.
But a 4-year-old child in distress does not move according to averages. Some children freeze, others walk in circles. Some run in short bursts, some follow light or sound, others hide from them. The variability is enormous, and no algorithm can capture the emotional, physical, or sensory state of a specific child at a specific moment. The model's role is advisory, not predictive. One of the strongest public misconceptions is the idea that technological tools fail only when mishandled. In fact, technology has limits that cannot be overcome even with perfect execution. Drone batteries drain quickly in heat. Dust interferes with sensors. Sudden gusts reduce stability. Thermal cameras become saturated by hot surfaces. Helicopters cannot hover over dangerous terrain. Aircraft cannot adjust instantly to patchy cloud cover that alters ground visibility. These are practical limitations, not operational mistakes. The belief that modern equipment should perform as flawlessly in the Outback as it does in controlled environments creates unrealistic pressure on search teams and unrealistic expectations in the community. Another important factor is that technology does not operate in isolation from human interpretation. A highly detailed image still requires a trained observer to interpret subtle shifts in color, shape, or contrast. Search crew fatigue, changing light conditions, and the sheer size of the area mean that small details can be overlooked, not because of negligence, but because no human can simultaneously process every visual cue across hundreds of square kilometers. When people imagine technological searches, they imagine automated detection systems scanning every centimeter. In practice, technology assists. It does not replace the observational limitations that all teams face. Despite these constraints, Australians often trust high-tech tools more than they trust terrain-based explanations. It is part of a broader cultural pattern in which technology is viewed as an equalizer, something that bridges distance, solves problems, and supplies clarity. The idea that the Outback can outperform modern equipment feels counterintuitive. Yet history across SA, NT, and WA shows that the environment routinely outmatched technology. Heat inversion layers distort imagery. Light during dusk and dawn reduces contrast. Vegetation blocks sensors. The landscape absorbs footprints, disperses scent, and hides movement. These are not unusual occurrences. They are standard environmental conditions. When the public hears that the largest search in South Australian history produced no significant physical evidence, many assume that the technology was either insufficient or misapplied. The truth is less dramatic. Even the most advanced tools have inherent gaps. They operate within the constraints of weather, environment, and probability. They are invaluable for covering ground quickly and guiding teams intelligently, but they cannot guarantee outcomes. To expect certainty from machines is to misunderstand the environment in which they were deployed. In the end, the limits of technology highlight a sobering reality. The Outback is not a controlled environment. It does not cooperate with equipment, does not preserve signs, and does not provide predictable conditions for detection. The belief in perfect technology is comforting, but it is ultimately a myth. The tools used in the search for Gus Lamont were functioning as intended, but they could not overcome a landscape designed by nature to conceal, scatter, and erase. This gap between technological expectation and environmental reality remains one of the clearest reasons why Australia still has no answers. As the months pass and the public conversation shifts from daily updates to long-term reflection, a set of unresolved questions continues to linger across Australia. These questions are not born from speculation or blame. They emerge from a genuine attempt to understand how a child could disappear in a region so familiar yet so unforgiving. They represent the collective uncertainty of a community that has followed every development, trusted the process, and watched one of the most extensive searches in South Australian history conclude without closure. Despite the expertise involved and the scale of the operation, the same questions that surfaced in the first week remain central today. The first and most persistent question is why no single trace was found across such a wide operational zone. In other missing child cases, even small indicators, a footprint, a dropped item, a disturbance in the ground, provide a foundation for further analysis. In this case, the complete absence of physical evidence has become its own mystery. Australians continue to ask whether this absence reflects the terrain, the conditions, or something less understood. The Outback's ability to erase signs is known to those who work in it, but to many observers, the idea that nothing remained, no mark, no displacement, nothing interpretable, feels deeply counterintuitive. It challenges the expectation that every event should leave behind some form of trace. The second unanswered question concerns the scale of disappearance itself. How can a 4-year-old vanish so completely, in daylight, within a station environment that the family knew intimately? The notion that a child could move beyond sight, leave no identifiable track, and remain undetected by large teams and advanced equipment continues to trouble viewers across the country. It is not a question about responsibility. It is a question about possibility. Australians are not asking who caused the disappearance, but how such an outcome could occur in the first place. The absence of explanation creates a space in which uncertainty becomes its own form of discomfort. A third question focuses on the search operation. If the search was as extensive as authorities described, and evidence shows that it was, why did it yield no result? The community has heard details about drones, thermal imaging, ground crews, air support, and modelling, yet the outcome appears disconnected from the effort. For many, this creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. An operation of this scale should have produced clarity, but it did not. Australians familiar with Outback conditions understand that search failures do happen, even when the response is thorough. However, for those encountering such a case for the first time, the idea that a child can remain undiscovered despite such concentrated effort remains difficult to accept. Beyond these practical questions lies a broader one. What is it about the Outback that remains outside public understanding? Some Australians follow rural and remote cases closely and know the challenges of heat, scrub cover, shifting ground, and vast distances. Others only encounter these realities through media reports and may not fully grasp the severity of the environment. The disappearance has prompted many to reassess what they thought they knew about regional Australia. The Outback is not merely a backdrop, it is an active force, shaping events, obscuring evidence, and complicating every attempted explanation. This question, what is it about the landscape that allowed this to happen, is one that continues to generate discussion. Another unresolved point relates to early modelling decisions. People want to understand why the initial assumptions about direction, speed, and distance may have diverged from the real conditions.
It is not a criticism of the process, it is a search for clarity. Modeling is a tool that depends on probability and averages, yet no model can perfectly account for the movement of a distressed 4-year-old in open terrain. Australians ask whether the earliest estimates unintentionally guided the search away from crucial areas or whether the terrain itself prevented any accurate modelling from the start. This question remains open because no retrospective analysis can perfectly reconstruct the child's path. The community also continues to wonder whether anyone passed through the area without being noticed. It is a question rooted not in accusation, but in the reality of remote properties where visitors can occasionally come and go without immediate detection. While SAPOL has stated that no evidence supports the involvement of another party, the question persists, simply because the absence of evidence leaves room for uncertainty. Australians are not making claims. They are grappling with a scenario in which multiple possibilities remain technically open due to the lack of definitive data. The final major question concerns the future of the investigation. Is there enough information left to guide further search efforts? With no physical evidence, no confirmed direction, and no clear endpoint, many wonder how Task Force Horizon determines its next steps. Can modelling be refined? Can new technology offer insight? Or has the case reached a point where progress depends entirely on new information, either from the environment or from someone who may know more? This is a question that sits at the centre of many long-term cases, and the community recognises that it does not have an easy answer. Together, these unresolved questions form the emotional and analytical landscape the country continues to navigate. They do not point toward blame or allegation. They reflect a public searching for understanding in the face of a disappearing clarity. For many Australians, the disappearance of Gus Lamont is not just a story about a missing child. It's a story about the limits of human knowledge, the unpredictability of the Outback, and the deep instinct to seek answers even when none appear readily available. The fact that these questions remain unanswered is not a failure of effort, but a reflection of a landscape and a situation that resist simple explanation. As this story stretches further into uncertainty, one truth becomes clearer for many Australians. The disappearance of a child in the Outback is not simply a matter of search efforts succeeding or failing. It is a reminder that even the most coordinated response, supported by experienced personnel, advanced technology, and structured modelling, cannot always overcome the scale and volatility of the land itself. The Outback is not a passive backdrop. It is an active variable, unpredictable, shifting, and often indifferent to human intervention. What happened to Gus Lamont is shaped as much by this vast environment as by any decisions made in the first hours or days. Across the investigation, SAPOL has consistently emphasized that the case remains open and that no possibility has been ruled out without evidence to support such a step. This stance reflects both procedural discipline and a recognition of the unknown. In situations where physical traces are limited or entirely absent, investigators cannot afford to close pathways prematurely. The guiding principle remains steady. Conclusions must come from evidence, not speculation. It is a position that aligns with the investigative standards used across South Australia and maintains public trust even when answers feel distant. The Lamont family continues to cooperate fully with Task Force Horizon, providing whatever detail, memory, and insight they can as time passes. Their cooperation is not treated as an extraordinary gesture, but as an essential part of a long-term investigation. Families hold unique fragments of context, daily routines, behavioral patterns, subtle habits that no modeling software or external expert can replicate. In cases where physical evidence is scarce, these fragments often form the foundation of the search narrative. Their willingness to participate remains one of the constants in an otherwise fluid situation. For many Australians, the concept of hope has shifted shape over the months. At the start, hope centred on an imminent discovery. As days passed, it became a quieter, more measured form of hope, one grounded not in expectation, but in the belief that answers can still surface. This form of hope is familiar in remote missing person cases, particularly in regions where terrain, heat, and distance complicate every effort. It does not diminish the gravity of the situation. Instead, it recognizes that outcomes in the Outback rarely follow predictable timelines. Throughout the search and its aftermath,
one line from Sapol has remained consistent. "We do not close a case until evidence tells us to do so." This statement carries weight beyond its simplicity. It conveys a commitment to method over assumption and to continuation over resignation. It acknowledges that the absence of evidence is not, by itself, evidence of any specific outcome. It also reinforces that the investigation is not resting in a static state. Even without major public updates, the process continues, reviewing data, re-evaluating modeling, analyzing earlier assumptions, and staying alert to new information from both the environment and the community. The broader Australian public continues to follow the case with a mixture of empathy, confusion, and concern. It is rare for a disappearance to produce so few leads, and the lack of resolution becomes a collective unease. Each unanswered question reflects the limits of human capability in a landscape that does not always yield to human understanding. The Outback's vastness is part of the nation's identity, but it is also a source of mystery, a reminder that there are places where human presence is temporary and fragile. As commentators, locals, and everyday Australians revisit the story, the questions that remain are not expressions of blame. They reflect a natural attempt to make sense of something that defies easy explanation. How can a child vanish within minutes? Why did the largest search operation in recent South Australian history return without clarity? How can an environment hold so much space, yet so few clues? These questions do not undermine the efforts of those who searched. Instead, they highlight the scale of the challenge they faced. In the end, the conclusion is not a statement of finality. It is an acknowledgement of the present reality. The Outback is a force that sits outside human control, and the investigation remains active because it must. Sapol continues to explore every possibility, guided by evidence and strengthened by the persistence of those who refuse to let the case drift into silence. The Lamont family remains engaged, carrying both the weight of uncertainty and the resilience required to move through each day without definitive answers. Across Australia, people continue to follow the story, not because they expect a single, dramatic resolution, but because they recognise the importance of understanding what happened, not only for the Lamont family, but for every community living in remote or regional environments. Missing person cases in the Outback challenge assumptions about safety, distance, time, and visibility. They remind the nation that, despite technological advances, there are still places where nature holds the final word. As this chapter of the investigation closes and another begins, one truth remains steady. The lack of answers does not reflect a lack of effort. It reflects the complexity of the terrain, the limits of human perception, and the unpredictable nature of real events. The story of Gus Lamont continues because the circumstances demand it, and because the hope for clarity persists, not loudly, but steadily. For now, the questions remain open, and the investigation remains open with them. Until evidence provides direction, the case stays active, watched closely by a nation that has not forgotten a 4-year-old who walked into the Outback and did not return.